经文，申命记13章3到4节，你也不可听那先知或是那做梦之人的话，因为这是耶和华你们的神试验你们，要知道你们是尽心尽性爱耶和华，不是。Thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God proveth you to know whether ye love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. 你们要顺从耶和华，你们的神，敬畏他，谨守他的诫命，听从他的话。Ye shall walk after the Lord your God, and fear him, and keep his commandments, and obey his voice, and ye shall serve him, and cleave unto him. 加尔文注释，因为耶和华你们的神试验你们。For the Lord your God proveth you. Latin. 每当这个意思为试探的词用在神身上时，并不是指用诡计欺骗、欺诈的网络来陷害无防备的人，而只是做查验。Whenever this word, which means to tempt, is applied to God, it is not used in a bad sense, for to take by guile, or to lay snares of deceit to entrap the unwary, but only for to prove or examine. 如今，神试验人的心，不是为了使他得知先前所不知道的事，而是为了先前被隐藏的事。Now, God proves men's hearts, not that he may learn what was before unknown, but to lay open what was before concealed. 因此，知道这个说法只是指经验性的认知。The expression to know, therefore, refers to experimental knowledge only. 奥古斯丁的解释显得平淡而且曲折，为要他知道，也就是使你们知道。The explanation of Augustine is tame and involved, that he may know, i.e., that he may cause you to know. 但既然把人的情感归给神是极为常见的事，又何必扭曲这些词语呢？这些词语所表示的，不过是神进行试验，使原本可能存疑的事实被真实的显明出来。But since it is so very common for human feelings to be attributed to God, where is the use of twisting words, which signify no more than that God makes trial, so that what might have been otherwise doubtful should be actually displayed? 正如神试验亚伯拉罕一样，当他在一件重要的事上试验他的信心或顺服的时节。Thus God tempted Abraham, when in an important matter he made trial of his faith or obedience. Genesis 22:1. 我方才提到，也是我们常常读到的那件事，并不与此相矛盾，就是神使用撒旦和恶人的工具性行为来试探人，因为我们必须考虑他所指向的试验目的，如此就会显明，他的设计与撒旦的恶意与诡计是完全不同的。Nor is what I have lately touched upon, and which we often read of, at all contradictory to this, viz., that God uses the instrumentality of Satan and of wicked men in order to tempt men, because we must take into consideration the object to which he directs these trials, whereby it will be manifest that his design is very different from the malice and wiles of Satan. 这里所提出的理由值得留意，因为它除去了让容易使软弱之心受扰的难题。The reason here given is worthy of remark, because it removes the difficulty by which weak minds might have been easily disturbed. 因为几乎没有比更不可能的事，撒旦以算计陷入争战，或毫无惩罚地把神的属性据为己有。For nothing is less probable than that Satan should insult God and involve heaven and hell in war, or that he should assume to himself with impunity an attribute of God. 因此，为了不让这样的讨论困扰，并使良善的人疲惫，或使他们陷在困惑之中，摩西预先回应这个问题，提醒他们，神并没有在此期间限制回他教会的看顾。Lest such a discussion should trouble and weary the good, or keep them in perplexity, Moses thus anticipates it by reminding them that God does not meanwhile lie idle or asleep, having abandoned the care of his church, 而是他有意地把真正敬虔的人带到试验之中，为要把他们与假冒为善的人分别出来。But that he designedly brings the truly pious to the proof, in order to distinguish them from the hypocrites. 而这正是在他们面对试探的攻击时，人持续坚守真信仰不从原本的地位坠落时所发生的。And this takes place when they constantly persevere in the true faith against the assaults of their temptations, and do not fall from their standing. 使徒在论到异端时也宣告了同样的事，就是异端必须在教会中出现，好叫那些经得起考验的人显明出来。The apostle declares the same thing also with regard to heresies, that they must needs arise in the church, that they which are approved may be made manifest. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 19. 所以，若神选择使我们那比金银更宝贵的信心坚固度，在烈火的不可击造，也不可向神发怨言。Wherefore we must not be impatient, nor murmur against God, if he chooses that the firmness of our faith, which is more precious than silver or gold, should be tried in the fiery furnace. 反而当谦卑地安息于他的公义与智慧之中。But it behoves us humbly to acquiesce in his justice and wisdom. 若仍有人反对，认为既然人的软弱是众所周知的，神在使人遭遇这些危险似乎是严苛，这样的质疑是可以立刻得到回应的。If any should still object, that, since the weakness of mankind is only too notorious, God deals with them somewhat unkindly when he subjects them to these dangerous temptations, an answer may be readily given. 我确实承认，因为我们肉体的感受是脆弱的，这件事看起来或许艰难，也似乎与神父亲般的慈爱不相符合的。I acknowledge indeed that, since our carnal sense is tender, this may seem hard and inconsistent with the fatherly kindness of God. 因为毫无疑问，当一个神迹呈现在我面前时，人很难不向他屈服。For, surely, when a miracle presents itself before our eyes, it is difficult not to submit to it. 然而，既然这样的试探所伤害的，只是那些不早已被定罪，而试探不过将其显露出来的人。But, since the temptation injures none but those whose impiety, which it lays bare, was already convicted and condemned, 而诚心敬拜神的人则被保守，不受伤害， whilst the sincere worshippers of God are preserved free from injury. 那么，若要夺去神阶下背叛与欺诈面具的这份自由，岂不是极其不公吗？ How unjust would it be to take away from God this liberty of plucking the mask from treachery and deceit? 凡是以清洁的心爱神的人，都被神圣之灵那不可战胜的能力所装备，使他不至于被虚假所缠累。Whosoever loves God with a pure heart is armed with the invincible power of the divine Spirit, that he should not be ensnared by falsehoods. 神如此赏赐真实而非虚假的今天，使一切心地诚实的人都蒙他忠心的看顾而得保守，从不感受那致命的创伤。God thus rewards true and not fictitious piety, so that whosoever are of a true heart should be protected by his faithful guardianship, and never feel the deadly wound. 同时，对于那些甘愿走向灭亡的人，他为何不把他们交付于公义的毁灭呢？ Meanwhile, why should he not devote to just destruction those who willfully desire to perish? 我们也不必为他在别处所宣告的话感到惊讶，就是他使假先知受迷惑，好借着他们那些急切寻找毁灭性欺骗的被施行公义的报应。Nor need we be surprised at what he elsewhere declares, that it is he who deceives false prophets, that by them he may inflict just vengeance on the reprobate, who eagerly go in search of their destructive deceits. 既然如此，所有良善的人都必然得胜，以致撒旦的诡计对他们而言，不过是操练其德的途径。Since, then, all the good are sure to overcome, so that the wiles of Satan are to them nothing but the exercises of their virtue. 那么，既然撒旦与恶人的恶意反而为他们预备了得胜与凯旋的根基，又为何要因此责怪神呢？ Why should God be blamed? Because the malice of Satan and of the wicked prepares for them the grounds of their victory and triumph? 只要我们谨守一准则，凡是全心爱神、敬畏神的人，必定躺在神的保护之下，稳妥而安全。Only let us cleave to this axiom, that all who heartily love and reverence God will always be sure and safe under the protection of God. 我承认，内心的正直确实是神特别的恩赐，是他隐秘拣选的果实。It is true, I confess, that integrity of heart is a peculiar gift of God and the fruit of his secret election. 然而， 既然被弃绝者自己的良心责备他们藐视神、虚伪、骄傲或败坏 ，but since their own consciences reproach the reprobate with their contempt of God, their hypocrisy, pride, or depravity, 那么把居住在他们里面的罪恶归咎于神，乃是不公义的。The blame of the iniquity that dwells in them is unjustly laid upon God. 因此，这就足以驳斥一切属肉体而悖逆的推论与亵渎之言。凡心地正直的人，都蒙圣灵的帮助而免受撒旦毒害的影响，并且没有任何人是在违背自己意愿的情况下灭亡的。This, then, is sufficient to refute all carnal and perverse reasonings and blasphemies, viz., that whosoever are right in heart are guarded by the aid of the Spirit from the poisonous influence of Satan, and that no one perishes against his will. 因此，我们这样的结论：凡那些诚心接受救恩教义，后来却拒绝并否认的人。And thus we come to the conclusion that all who, having once seemed to embrace the doctrines of salvation, afterwards reject and deny them, 从来就不曾真正拥有什么，只不过披着虚假信仰的外衣而已。Had never possessed anything more than the disguise of a false profession. 因为若他们真诚的爱神，就必在一切足以扰乱他们的事中，仍然心志坚定。If they sincerely loved God, they would remain firm in heart in the midst of all things tending to disturb them. 诚然，有时敬虔的人也会陷入错误，并被恶人引诱。It will indeed sometimes happen that the pious also will fall into errors, and will be seduced by the wicked. 但这只是在某些方面，并且只是一段时间。But it will only be in some respects and for a time. 因此，他们从未离开根基，并且很快就会恢复过来。So that they never fall from the foundation, and presently recover themselves. Respiskant. 此外，也必须注意到，他们为自己的疏忽或不稳定付上代价。And then, it must also be observed, they pay the penalty of their negligence, or instability. 因为他们没有充分留心神的话，或没足够的委身于敬虔的操练。Because they have not been sufficiently attentive to God's word, or have not sufficiently devoted themselves to religious pursuits. 由此，我们进一步得知，当许多人以看见许多争论与纷争使他们分心为理由，离弃宗教教义时 hence we further gather, that whilst many turn away professedly from the doctrines of religion, on the ground of their seeing so many contentions and disputes to distract them, 这不过是掩盖他们亵慢神或憎恶神的虚假借口。It is a mere vain excuse to cover their profane neglect or hatred of God. 诚然，意见上的分歧极大，争论也非常激烈。It is true that there are great discrepancies of opinion and very warm contentions. 然而，凡以受教与温柔的心寻求真理的人 but whosoever in a teachable and gentle spirit shall seek after truth, 并且把自己交出来，甘心顺服，做神的门徒 and shall give himself over and submit himself as the disciple of God, 他就永远不会缺乏分辨与判断的灵。He will never be without the spirit of judgment and discretion. 但既然有人轻蔑地听，有人极度藐视，有人巴不得神的话完全被消灭，另一些人的他不以为意。But, since some listen disdainfully, some supremely despise it. Some wish that God's word were altogether destroyed, others think lightly of it. 先知的话就仍然成立，该死的就让他死吧。撒迦利亚书11章9节 The saying of the prophet holds good, that dieth, let it die, 11 verse 9, 以及保罗随后所宣告的，若有人不明白，就由他分是38节。And what Paul after him declares, But if any man be ignorant, let him be ignorant. Corinthians 14 verse 38. 因为一向以来，神的真理从向任何人隐藏，除非是那心思被这世界的神弄瞎的人。哥林多后书4章4节。Since it has always been the case that God's truth was never hidden from anybody, except him whose mind the God of this world has blinded. 2 Corinthians 4:4. 而这种情况尤其在天上的光已经照耀的时候，那光不容任何人迷失，除非他们自己闭上眼睛。And this especially takes place when light has shone from heaven, which suffers none to go astray, but those who shut their eyes. 因此，立刻附上的补救之道就是，你们要顺从耶和华你们的神。The remedy, therefore, is immediately subjoined. Ye shall walk after the Lord your God. 仿佛摩西在说，只要他们有神，他们走在正路上，就足以保守他们。As if Moses had said, it was sufficient for their preservation, that they had God to guide them in the right way. 因为他已经以白白的恩惠先行领导他们。Who had already prevented them by his gratuitous bounty. 然而，既然许多人不回应神的呼召，当他指示道路给他们时，也不理会他。But, since numbers respond not to God's call, and regard him not when he points out the way to them, 因此又加上敬畏他这句话。The words and fear him are added, 因为敬畏耶和华是智慧的遍世界。Because the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. 圣论里，最后，摩西再次殷切教导，只要人立定心志顺服神。Finally, Moses again inculcates that, if men are only resolved to obey God, 他就必借着他的声音充分教导他们当行的事。They will be sufficiently taught by his voice what they ought to do. 专靠这个词表明了持守不变的坚韧。By the word cleave, perseverance is denoted. 因此，他也间接责备那些离弃并忘记神、从虚空幻想而偏离正道之人的不稳定。And Titus, he indirectly reproves the instability of those who forsake and forget God, and go astray after empty imaginations.